and welcome to the American Cinema History of Film course, originating from the University of Utah. In this course, we're going to examine the characteristics of the American cinema as both an art and an entertainment industry. The primary emphasis of the course will be on Hollywood, but we will not neglect the independents and those outside of Hollywood who've contributed to making the American film the most important American contribution to world culture. We're going to see how the cinema operates, how it functions, both from the artistic side and the industry side. And even more important, we're going to examine how it reflects American culture, how it tells us things about who we are and what we want to be, how it interprets our own past and points us towards an American future. We're going to do this through a series of television programs, which you're watching right now, on the American cinema. And we also have a text by John Belton called American Cinema, American Culture. This will be supplemented by your own independent viewing of full-length feature films and your own writing and thinking about them. Combining all of this, it should be a very satisfactory and satisfying educational experience. We're going to be watching television programs on the classical Hollywood style, the studio system, the star, the romantic comedy, combat film, the Western, the film noir, and other topics. Now, these tapes are very dense, and because of that, and because of the time block that we have, we're able to repeat most of them during the course of the programming over this quarter. In addition, should you miss one of these programs and not be able to find it, there are copies available on reserve in the Marriott Library for your viewing on site. Again, the tapes are dense. You might want to take notes while watching them. I'll try and sum them up, the important points at the end of them. What I'm going to ask you to do is to read along in your text week by week as we see the programs, and this is all outlined in your syllabus. And then I'll ask you to write 2 5-page essays. These essays will be based on ideas that you come up with regarding films that you view outside of class. Now, at the end of each chapter of John Belton's book, there's a list of recommended viewings, recommended films that you can watch that are readily available in video stores that often pop up just in normal television programming and are all, again, on reserve in the Marriott Library. You select on your own. Let's say you were to choose The Lady Eve by Preston Sturges, which has Henry Fonda and Barbara Stanwyck, one of my favorite comedies. You could either find that at a video store or it is on reserve in the library. And then you will write a 5-page essay relating issues raised in the romantic comedy segment of the course and in the romantic comedy chapter in John Belton's book to the movie. So it should be something that will be fun for you. In addition, we'll have a midterm and a final examination. Again, the dates are given in your syllabus, and there will be review prior to those exams. The exams will consist of matching true and false, short answer. There will be a writing component on both of the examinations. And they will draw from issues raised in the tapes themselves and in the textbook. And wherever possible, I will ask you things that are repeated in some form, both on the tapes and in the text. They say that reinforcement is the mother of learning, and I believe that to be true. Now, to get right to the subject matter at hand, if we were to think of the art forms that we identify as cultural greatness emanating from different countries, we might think of the painting from France, the music that has come out of Germany, the literature of England. With America, we would doubtless say the movies. Now, the difference between these different art forms, these different media, is that we think of literature and painting and most music as somehow being high art. The movies we think of as popular culture. But I'd like to stress that there's a great paradox even in that most commercial of movie industries, the industry of Hollywood, and that is the paradox of a medium which is both commerce and art. There have always been art movies coming out of Hollywood. There have always been artists working in Hollywood. Often, as in the case of Charles Chaplin, they are also consummate businessmen, but they are artists as well. And it's unfair to to expect that only art movies would come out of Hollywood, but it's also equally unfair to think that Hollywood is just in business for the buck. There's a long tradition of individual artists in what is essentially a factory system. And I hope to illustrate that today by showing you some clips from films by D.W. Griffith, who, along with Chaplin, I would say, are the fathers of the Hollywood art. Now, art, according to Northrop Frye, the late great critic, has to possess a style and a message. In other words, art isn't just pure form, nor is it just preaching. It's a combination of the two. It must have ideas as well as an aesthetic form to be art. Now, in the movies, there's a peculiar bent towards realism that comes from the nature of the camera itself and the ability of the camera to copy, at least surface, reality. So my own understanding of what turns this mere copying of photographic reality into art is the message coming through with a dose of symbolism and metaphor. So that's where the Hollywood art, and I think the European and Asian film art, is a combination or an integration of realism plus symbolism. And again, we're going to see that in the work of these two fathers of Hollywood, D.W. Griffith and Charles Chaplin. We might also remember, while we watch all these programs that are glorifying the existence of the artist in Hollywood and glorifying both the system and the individuals who were its greatest creators, that Hollywood has in general been very unkind to individual artists. In other words, the wonderful messages that we get in the movies, the fates of characters, the satisfying endings, whether happy or unhappy. A successful Hollywood movie usually has a satisfying, in some way, ending, is very different from the lives of the people who have worked in this industry. Griffith died in the Knickerbocker Hotel in Hollywood, completely ignored and unwanted by the industry he had created as an economically feasible one. Chaplin was rejected not only by Hollywood, but by the entire country, and spent his August years in Switzerland. But that aside, let's go to the works of art themselves, and in particular, some film clips from Griffith's great epic, The Birth of a Nation. Now, The Birth of a Nation, made in 1915, was what we would call the first commercial blockbuster. It returned a huge profit, but also was a huge risk, costing very much money to produce. But it showed to Hollywood that a movie in which a lot of money was invested could earn that money back and then some. And it's the tack on which Hollywood has followed ever since. But Griffith's success came not only because he told an emotionally charged story about North and South and the fighting of the Civil War and the subsequent Reconstruction. In this film, he set the standards for realism, theatricality, and spectacle in the Hollywood movie. And he also showed how innovations which he formulated in both filming and editing could make the story told in the motion picture a very powerful experience, a very immediate and real experience for the audience. In filming, Griffith did some things that nowadays I think we would think of as common sense, but back then it took somebody to actually do this first and show that it would work, take very cumbersome equipment, a very primitive kind of equipment, and film stock, and get images on it that would have great emotional power. And Griffith did this, first of all, by varying the camera distance from the subject. The first movies tended to set up the camera at a standard stage distance from the prime theater seat distance. Griffith realized that you could involve the spectator far more immediately in the motion picture experience by moving the camera from a long shot to a medium shot to a close-up. Second, though we don't see it in the Birth of a Nation clips, we will see this in the Intolerance clip, lighting for effect. Not just lighting to illuminate the subject matter in front of the camera, but also to interpret the relationships of the subjects to each other and to create a mood or an atmosphere that evoked certain feelings in the audience. Third, we have a dramatic use of settings, not just a backdrop, not just something to fill the screen, but something that relates somehow to the theme of the story that Griffith is trying to tell. Sometimes these settings are natural settings, as we'll see in The Birth of a Nation. The second thing that he does is use editing techniques. This is something that you think about when you're shooting and you perfect in the cutting room afterwards. The first is the notion of invisible editing. That is to say, that kind of editing, that kind of cutting that ideally the audience, the spectator, whether they're a filmmaker or not, doesn't notice because it's following the dramatic logic of the scene. In other words, we break from the long shot to the medium shot to the close-up when we want to, when the director wants us to want to. And it creates the feelings that the director wants to create and communicates the meaning that the director wants to communicate. The other kind of editing that Griffith perfected is parallel montage, also known as cross-cutting. In other words, taking a subject that's in one location at one time and cutting to another location, using that to communicate information, to create drama, to heighten suspense. We're going to see that in some of these clips from The Birth of a Nation. Let's look at this first segment now, what I call the picture in the locket sequence, in which the brother from the north, Phil Stoneman, shows his friend from the south, Ben Cameron, the picture of his sister in a locket. Let's look at this scene. You notice in this remarkable clip how Griffith goes from the full shot, where we see all of the subjects in the frame, and moves in for the close-up. And it's just when we want to, when it's emotionally satisfying. What he also does is we notice that Ben Cameron is struck by the image that he's looking at. But Griffith doesn't let us see that image. Instead, he heightens our anticipation so that finally, when Ben runs off to the side and opens it up and we cut to the extreme close-up of Lillian Gish's picture in the frame, it's just when we want to see it. And it's, since our anticipation has been heightened, the emotional payoff is greater. Now that's called invisible editing. It's called breaking the scene down according to its dramatic logic. But we also get another kind of interesting cut, and that is to the close-up of the cotton plant. This is where Griffith turns the personal story into a larger story, the story of the South, the economy of slavery, the economy of cotton that leads to and in part is responsible for the conflagration of the Civil War. So we get just about everything in this one scene. The dramatic use of the setting, the slaves in the field picking the cotton. Always we have the personal story and the larger historical story. And this is Griffith's formula for success in this kind of spectacle film. The combining of a story of characters with whom we can identify and whom we become emotionally involved with, and an important historical event. Individual fates become wrapped up with social destiny, intimacy and spectacle combine, emotion and theme, or feeling and idea become integrated. And as it's successful in this film, it's something that Hollywood ever since has been trying to do, often with great success. We're going to look at a meeting on the battlefield between Ben and Phil. the one fighting for the South, the other for the North. And again, we'll see an illustration of Griffith's techniques for editing and staging of action, as well as the combining of the historical moment with the personal story. The meeting of Ben and Phil on the battlefield might seem ludicrous if it weren't so emotionally powerful and satisfying. What you have here is an incredible battle sequence, choreographed to perfection, with a very small number of extras. I remember when Lillian Gish and Griffith saw Gone with the Wind, produced 25 years later. Griffith noted that what it took thousands of MGM extras to accomplish in a battle scene, he had done with no more than 125 extras at any one time. He also sets up another rule of screen direction, with one side always moving left to right and the other right to left, so that we never are in any doubt as to who's on what side and which side is the north, which is the south. The extreme long shots show us the beauty of the violence, but Griffith doesn't spare us the pain and the guilt that we feel for indulging in that aesthetic violence, with awesome close-ups of the leftovers of the battle, the dead, the price paid by both the victors and the vanquished. The meeting of Phil and Ben illustrates this spectacle success formula, the personal story integrated with great historic events. We can see further how this works specifically in Birth of a Nation, the Camerons and the Stonemans, the story of two families becoming friends and then separated by the great historic event of the Civil War. Ben and Elsie and Phil and Margaret are going to become couples, but they are on opposite sides. We get the social story of the destruction and reconstruction of the South. In other words, if one story doesn't interest us, the other one will. This, for some reason, is a war like the Vietnamese War, in which many, many films have been made, perhaps because the war was not as simple as World War II or the Revolutionary War, about which far fewer successful films have actually been made. The sentimental romance, one must remember that Griffith, above all, was a Victorian idealist using a tool of the modern age, the motion picture camera. We get reconstructions of major battles and Lincoln's assassination, all combine in the last-minute rescue in which the North and South antagonisms and reconciliation are resolved. We're going to look at that clip now and see how Griffith uses parallel editing, parallel montage, cross-cutting to heighten our suspense and get us involved and actually get us pulling for a side that we generally don't pull for and probably shouldn't outside of the context of this film. Let's look at this last-minute rescue sequence now. This is one of the great last-minute rescues in the history of the cinema. What Griffith uses in suspense cross-cutting is what we would call accelerated montage. That is to say, cutting together of smaller and smaller pieces of film to heighten the suspense and make it seem, in fact, as if the Ku Klux Klan riders are riding faster and faster. If you notice, the length of the shots of the Klan riders decreases in time as the importance of their arrival at the besieged cabin becomes critical. This also shows kind of the provocative nature of this film, its skewed view, its racism, that has worked at the box office, but is also very disturbing to people. Now, Griffith himself was perhaps showing the narrowness of his own background as the son of an impoverished Confederate officer from Kentucky. He naively, I think, presented the result of the lore of his own upbringing on the screen and seemed genuinely surprised by the attacks on him that it provoked because he saw it as a humanist film. In fact, there's a great and long legacy for The Birth of a Nation in terms of spectacle and theatricality, that intermixing of the individual fates and the profound historical event. Buster Keaton with The General gives us another Civil War story that brings together North and South. John Ford in The Grapes of Wrath, who actually worked on The Birth of a Nation, played one of the Klan riders and broke his leg, whereupon Griffith, again being a very sentimental man, sat Ford down next to him for the duration of the production. Gone with the Wind, of course, echoes Birth of a Nation, as does William Wyler's Ben-Hur. Warren Beatty's Reds, again, combines the story of John Reed with that larger historical moment of the Russian Revolution. The Deer Hunter does the same for Vietnam, as does Platoon. So there is a legacy of this film, and if you look at this list, you'll notice that so many of these titles were Best Picture or nominated for that in their own time, and won a lot of awards and had a lot of box office appeal. In Griffith's next film, Intolerance, he tried to make up for some of the scandal he had caused with Birth of a Nation. In Intolerance, Griffith not only sought to placate and respond to his critics, And he made in the film a profoundly humane movie. But he also showed that other strain in the Hollywood cinema, that strain towards art, towards experiment. And Intolerance is properly called an experimental narrative, as compared to the conventional theatrical narrative of Birth of a Nation, where the movie does all the work for you. Intolerance makes considerable demands upon the audience. In it, rather than the one story of Birth of a Nation, we have four narratives intercut. We have an even greater use of symbolism, as we saw with the one cotton plant in Birth of a Nation. In Intolerance, symbolism works throughout the film, in particularly in the image of the woman rocking the cradle, which provides the transition between all four of the stories. We get an associative montage, that is to say, shots cut into the film that have meaning, but the meaning relates to the theme of the film rather than to any of the individual stories being told. There's a larger meaning. And then finally, ideas are more important than emotion in this film. This film is about its ideas rather than about the characters who express them. So that is a very demanding thing to lay on an audience when you need to have millions and millions of people see the film to make it commercially viable. Pauline Kael is the one who says it is perhaps the greatest film ever made, and yet it was one that did not have the great commercial success of The Birth of a Nation. Griffith always believed in, again, being a Victorian idealist, in the social responsibility of art. In other words, that it wasn't just enough to make entertainment, but that your movies had to have a message. And despite what Sam Goldwyn is reported to have said when someone brought a heavy movie proposal to him, that if you want to send a message, use Western Union. Many movie makers from the early days of Hollywood, Sam Goldwyn among them, made movies that had messages to send. And Intolerance is perhaps one of the most ambitious in that way, certainly the most ambitious of its time, if not all time. The four stories that it tells are the fall of Babylon, 539 BC, the crucifixion of Jesus, the slaughter of the Huguenots, also known as the St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre, 1572 AD, and a modern story set in 1915 when it was shot. The symbolic transition connecting all of humanity is Lillian Gish rocking the cradle in the film. What I'm going to show us now is the last 4 minutes from Intolerance, the last-minute rescue, in which we again see an example of accelerated montage. Now, in this segment, the St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre and the Fall of Babylon stories have already been completed, and we begin with the crucifixion. The magnificence of the imagery in this concluding sequence from Intolerance is not even matched by that in Birth of a Nation. We see that the crucifixion in a majestic long shot, and then the rescue from the hanging in the modern story, again with that montage which cuts together smaller and smaller pieces of film, followed by Griffith's vision of savage battle replaced by peace, of heaven looking down and enveloping earth. It's very strong stuff, and more difficult for an audience which is used to identifying with one or two characters and their fates throughout a film. This particular communication of meaning, this kind of film, taught the Soviets how to argue through film, how you could use editing to communicate very clearly your ideas. But Intolerance even goes beyond that mere teaching of people how to argue, and in fact contains utopian themes that have touched some of the most ambitious films ever made. And if we look at this list of the legacy of Intolerance, films like von Stroheim's Greed, again, von Stroheim, like John Ford, worked on The Birth of a Nation, and von Stroheim also worked on Intolerance and was one of the actors in the Fall of Babylon sequence. Kubrick's 2001, Coppola's Apocalypse Now, Terry Gilliam's Brazil, and I think even Kevin Costner's Dances with Wolves have this feel, this sense of scope that, and desire for utopianism, if even a failed utopia as we see in Brazil, that has caused some of our greatest filmmakers to, in a sense, reach as far as one possibly can and do a narrative that is all-encompassing. What we're going to do now is look at the first of the American cinema programs, this one on the classical Hollywood style, fathered by Chaplin and Griffith. After this segment, I'll be back, and we'll look at the ways in which Charlie Chaplin, like Griffith, is one of the two fathers of the Hollywood cinema.